Benjamin Foster had barely unloaded his truck when the homeowners association showed up at his door demanding he sign their papers and pay a debt he never owed. He looked the president dead in the eye and said 5 quiet words: "I'm not a member." Furious, she called the police and accused him of trespassing on his own property. Officers arrived expecting an easy arrest. What they found instead would unravel 13 years of lies and hand this quiet stranger control over land the entire neighborhood depended on. If property rights homeowner association drama and satisfying legal payback fascinate you, subscribe and stay for the unbelievable ending. The house Benjamin had purchased was an old wooden cabin sitting at the far edge of the development, close enough to the lake that he could hear water lapping against the dock from his back porch. He was 42 years old, quiet by nature, the kind of man who measured his words before he spent them and never raised his voice even when provoked. Friends who had helped him move described him as unshakable, someone who had spent years in commercial real estate law before stepping back to live a slower life. He had bought the cabin sight unseen, after a broker described it as a forgotten property, one that had been sitting untouched for over a decade while the rest of the neighborhood grew up around it, with newer homes, paved roads, and a shiny clubhouse by the water. Before he had even finished carrying his furniture inside, a neighbor named Carol Jennings stopped by to welcome him and offer a warning in the same breath. She told him that the homeowners association in Cedar Hollow Estates was notorious, run by a woman who treated every rule like scripture and every resident like a subordinate. Carol explained that Natalie Brooks had been president for 6 years, and in that time she had fined people for the wrong color mailbox, threatened liens over unmowed lawns, and once tried to stop a family from putting up a wheelchair ramp because it violated an aesthetic guideline. Benjamin thanked her for the warning but said little else, filing the information away the way he filed everything, quietly and without visible reaction. 2 days later, the black vehicles arrived. Natalie stepped out first, trailed by 3 board members who seemed to exist mainly to nod whenever she spoke. She introduced herself as the president of the association and handed Benjamin a thick folder containing a membership application, a fee schedule, and a printed copy of the community bylaws. She explained in the tone of someone reciting a memorized speech that every property within the boundaries of Cedar Hollow Estates was required to join the association, pay annual dues, and follow all architectural and behavioral guidelines without exception. She told him the previous owner had let the account fall behind, and that as the new owner he now inherited a debt of nearly $4,000 in unpaid fees, penalties, and interest. Benjamin took the folder, glanced through it for perhaps 30 seconds, and then handed it back to her without a hint of anger in his expression. He told her plainly that he had reviewed his closing documents thoroughly before signing anything, and that nothing in them indicated his property was part of the homeowners association. Natalie laughed, not unkindly at first, the way a teacher might laugh at a student who had clearly misunderstood a lesson. She told him that every property on this side of the lake had belonged to the association since it was founded, and that whatever he believed he had read, he had simply misread it. Benjamin only repeated himself, calm and unwavering. "I'm not a member," he said again, and something in his tone made 2 of the board members exchange uneasy glances. Natalie's smile thinned. She reminded him that non-compliance could result in daily fines, liens against the property, and eventually legal action to force compliance. Benjamin nodded politely, as if she had just told him the weather forecast, and said he understood her position but that it did not change the facts of his ownership. He suggested without any hostility that she have her legal counsel review the recorded deed before pursuing anything further. That single sentence seemed to strike a nerve because Natalie's expression shifted from confident to something closer to offended, as though the mere suggestion that she might be wrong was itself a form of disrespect. She turned to her board members and told them this was exactly the kind of resistance the association could not tolerate, warning that if word spread that one resident could simply refuse membership, the entire structure they had built over the years would collapse. Then she turned back to Benjamin, straightened her jacket, and delivered the line that would echo through the neighborhood for weeks afterward. She told him that if he refused to cooperate, she would have no choice but to let the police handle it, since in her mind anyone occupying a home inside association boundaries without proper documentation was essentially an unauthorized occupant. Benjamin simply looked at her unbothered and told her that she was welcome to call whoever she liked. Natalie did exactly that within the hour, and the quiet cul-de-sac that had welcomed Benjamin Foster only 2 days earlier was about to become the center of a very different kind of neighborhood story. The call Natalie placed to the local police department was dramatic enough that 2 patrol units were dispatched within 20 minutes, lights flashing as they pulled into the narrow street in front of Benjamin's cabin. She had told the dispatcher that an unknown man had taken over a vacant property belonging to the homeowners association, that he refused to provide identification, and that residents were concerned for their safety. By the time the officers arrived, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the flashing lights and the unmistakable sight of Natalie Brooks standing with her arms crossed, clearly enjoying the attention her authority seemed to command. The two officers who stepped out of their vehicles introduced themselves as Officer Mark Doyle and Officer Sarah Kane, both of them scanning the scene with the practiced neutrality of people who had responded to dozens of neighborhood disputes before. Natalie approached them immediately, launching into her account before either officer could ask a single question. She described Benjamin as uncooperative, evasive, and possibly dangerous, insisting that he had ignored repeated requests to prove ownership of the home he was living in. Several neighbors nodded along, though none of them had actually witnessed anything beyond Benjamin, calmly declining to sign a folder of paperwork. Benjamin walked out onto his porch when he heard his name mentioned, moving with the same unhurried composure he had shown 2 days earlier. He did not raise his voice, did not argue, and did not so much as glance at Natalie with irritation. Instead, he greeted both officers, politely introduced himself by his full name, and asked if they would like to see his documentation. Officer Doyle nodded, clearly relieved to be dealing with someone reasonable, and Benjamin disappeared inside for less than a minute before returning with a manila folder of his own, considerably thinner than the one Natalie had tried to hand him earlier. Inside that folder was a certified copy of the recorded deed, a title insurance policy, and a closing statement from the sale that had taken place only 3 weeks prior. Officer Kane examined the documents carefully, while Officer Doyle asked Benjamin a series of routine questions, all of which he answered directly and without hesitation. Natalie, growing visibly impatient, interrupted to remind the officers that regardless of what paperwork he was holding, the Homeowners Association had authority over every property within its recorded boundaries, and that authority included the right to enforce membership on new owners. She insisted that this was simply how the community had always operated, and that allowing exceptions would open the door to chaos. Officer Doyle asked her in a tone that was polite, but pointed whether she had a copy of the association's recorded governing documents that specifically listed this address as part of the association's jurisdiction. Natalie hesitated for the first time since the vehicles had arrived, glancing back at her board members as though one of them might magically produce the paperwork she needed. None of them moved. She told the officers that the documents existed at the management office and that she could have them delivered by the following morning, but Officer Kane, who had continued studying the deed Benjamin provided, looked up with an expression that shifted the entire mood of the confrontation. She informed Natalie that the recorded deed for this specific address contained a legal description that did not match any parcel referenced in the association's publicly filed plat. In simpler terms, she explained this house appeared to predate the association entirely, and nothing in the paperwork Benjamin had shown them indicated any obligation to join anything. Natalie's face went pale for a moment before she recovered, insisting there had to be some clerical error, some outdated filing that simply hadn't been corrected. Officer Doyle told her calmly that regardless of any confusion over association membership, there was clearly no criminal trespassing occurring here, since the man standing in front of them held a valid recorded deed to the property. The crowd that had gathered to watch Benjamin Foster get arrested instead watched the officers thank him for his cooperation, wish him a good afternoon, and return to their patrol cars without so much as a warning issued in his direction. Natalie stood frozen on the sidewalk, her folder of bylaws suddenly looking a great deal less impressive than it had an hour earlier, while whispers began rippling through the small crowd of neighbors who had come expecting a very different outcome. What none of them realized yet was that the discrepancy the officers had noticed was only the smallest thread in a much larger tangle, one that was about to unravel everything the association believed it controlled. Later that same afternoon, after the patrol cars had gone and most of the onlookers had drifted back to their own homes, Natalie returned to Benjamin's porch alone, her confidence dented but not entirely gone. She told him she intended to get to the bottom of this discrepancy, and that she still believed the association's boundaries included his property, regardless of what the deed appeared to say. Benjamin invited her to sit an offer that seemed to surprise her, and then went inside to retrieve something he had been saving for exactly this kind of conversation. He returned with an old yellowed county plat map carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, the kind of document most people would never think to request from a records office. He spread it across the small table on his porch and explained patiently and without a trace of condescension that this cabin and the surrounding acreage had been platted and recorded nearly 2 decades before Cedar Hollow Estates had ever been developed. The original owner, a man named Walter Higgins, had never signed any covenant, never joined any association, and had in fact sold the land directly to the developer's predecessor, with an explicit carve-out excluding it from future association jurisdiction. Benjamin pointed to a small annotation near the property line, a handwritten note from the original surveyor indicating that the parcel remained independently held. Natalie stared at the map for a long moment, clearly searching for some flaw in what she was seeing but found none. She told him the association's records simply did not reflect any of this, insisting that as far as she and the board were concerned, every property within the physical boundary of the neighborhood was subject to their rules regardless. of what old paperwork claimed otherwise. Benjamin reminded her gently but firmly that a homeowners association could not simply declare authority over land it never legally acquired, no matter how long that assumption had gone unchallenged. He asked her a question that seemed to catch her completely off guard, one she clearly had never been asked in 6 years of running the association. "Who told you the association owned this road?" he asked, gesturing toward the narrow access path connecting his driveway to the main community street. Natalie opened her mouth to answer, and then closed it again, visibly searching for a response that never came. She admitted after a long pause that the assumption had simply been passed down from the previous board president, a woman who had retired years earlier and who Natalie had never personally questioned. She had inherited the belief the way one inherits an old family story repeated so many times that nobody thought to verify whether it was actually true. Benjamin told her he understood how that could happen, but that understanding did not change the legal reality sitting on the table between them. He explained that he intended to have his own attorney review every recorded document related to the association's founding just to be certain his own understanding was correct before making any further claims. Natalie left his porch that evening, noticeably quieter than she had arrived, the folder of bylaws still tucked under her arm but no longer held with quite the same authority. Word of the confrontation had already begun spreading through the neighborhood, distorted and exaggerated with each retelling until half the residents believed Benjamin was some kind of squatter and the other half believed he might actually be telling the truth. What none of them yet understood was that Benjamin's questions were not idle curiosity. He had a very specific reason for asking about the road, the boundaries, and the association's assumed authority, and that reason was about to reshape the entire neighborhood's understanding of who actually owned what. 3 days after the confrontation on his porch, Benjamin invited Natalie and the full board of directors to a meeting at his cabin, an invitation that surprised everyone who heard about it since most people in his position would have simply hired a lawyer and let the matter play out through official section channels. Instead, Benjamin wanted to explain things directly in person before anything escalated further. When Natalie arrived with board members Robert Hale, Diane Whitfield, and a quieter man named Thomas Reyes, they found Benjamin waiting on his porch with a stack of documents considerably thicker than anything he had shown the police. He began by clarifying something that immediately silenced the room. He explained that when he purchased the cabin 3 weeks earlier, he had not simply bought a single lot with a house on it. The sale, arranged through an estate liquidation after Walter Higgins's descendants decided to sell off the remaining family holdings, had included considerably more than anyone in the association realized. Benjamin told them the parcel he now owned encompassed the surrounding lakeside acreage, the grassy common area residents referred to as the North Meadow, the narrow access road connecting several homes to the main street, an old boat dock the association had been using for community events, and a strip of land directly behind. The clubhouse that the board had long assumed belonged to the community itself. Natalie stared at him, as though he had just spoken in a foreign language, her expression shifting from disbelief to something closer to panic, as the weight of what he was describing began to settle. She told him flatly that what he was claiming was impossible, that the clubhouse land had been part of the association's holdings since the development was built, and that the dock had been maintained by community funds for over a decade. Benjamin did not raise his voice or show any satisfaction in delivering this information. He simply reached for another folder, opened it, and slid a copy of his closing documents across the table. Closing documents say otherwise, he told her, his tone as even as it had been on the very first day they met. Robert Hale, who had said almost nothing since arriving, leaned forward to examine the legal description attached to the deed, his face growing paler with every line he read. Diane Whitfield asked, in a voice noticeably smaller than before, whether this meant the community had been using private property without any agreement at all. Benjamin told her that appeared to be exactly the case, though he was careful to note that he had no personal grudge against any of them and had not purchased the land with any intention of causing trouble. Natalie, however, was not ready to accept defeat so easily. She insisted there must be some mistake in the title work, some clerical oversight that a proper investigation would correct, and she announced that the association would be retaining its own legal counsel to review everything Benjamin claimed to have. Benjamin welcomed the idea, telling her he thought that was a wise decision and that he would be happy to make copies of every document available to whichever attorney they hired. His willingness to cooperate seemed to unsettle Natalie more than any argument could have, since it left her with no villain to fight against, only a calm, well-documented reality she could not seem to escape. As the meeting ended and the board members filed out in stunned silence, Robert Hale lingered behind for a moment, glancing back at Benjamin with an expression that was difficult to read. He said nothing, but something in his face suggested he already suspected the coming weeks would confirm everything Benjamin had just told them, and that suspicion would prove entirely correct once the professionals got involved. Within a week, a representative from Halbrook Realty Group, the firm that had handled the original estate sale, arrived at Cedar Hollow Estates alongside an attorney named Gregory Lawson, who had been retained specifically to walk an association through the legal realities of the situation. The meeting took place inside the community clubhouse itself, the very building whose backyard now technically belonged to Benjamin Foster, and the irony of that fact was not lost on anyone in attendance. Nearly 30 residents crowded into the room, drawn by rumors that had grown wilder with each passing day, ranging from claims that the entire neighborhood might be seized, to whispers that Benjamin was secretly some kind of land developer, planning to evict everyone. Gregory Lawson began by calmly laying out the documented facts, speaking slowly enough that even the most skeptical residents in the room could follow along. He presented the recorded deed, a professional land survey conducted just before closing a title insurance policy issued by a reputable underwriter, and the full closing statement from the sale. Each document, he explained independently, confirmed the same conclusion. Benjamin Foster was the legitimate, fully documented owner of not only his cabin, but the surrounding meadow, the access road, the boat dock, and the strip of land directly behind the clubhouse. He then addressed the question that had been hanging over the room since the meeting began, explaining that the homeowners association had never purchased, leased, or otherwise legally acquired any of that land. There was no recorded transfer, no easement agreement, no documented right-of-way, nothing beyond decades of informal use that had simply gone unquestioned by residents and board members alike. Natalie, seated near the front of the room, tried to interject, insisting that the association had maintained that land for years and that continuous use alone should count for something. Gregory Lawson acknowledged her point calmly, but explained that continuous use without a legal claim, particularly on privately owned and clearly documented land, generally did not establish any enforceable right, especially when the true owner had never granted permission. A murmur spread through the crowd as residents began to grasp the full scope of what this meant. The road many of them drove on daily, the dock where children fished every summer, the meadow used for the annual community picnic, all of it sat on land the association had never actually owned. Diane Whitfield, visibly shaken, asked what would happen now, her voice carrying the kind of dread that comes from realizing a mistake has been compounding silently for years. Gregory Lawson turned toward Benjamin, who had remained quiet throughout most of the meeting, seated near the back of the room with his hands folded calmly in his lap. The attorney explained that Benjamin held every legal right to restrict access to his property immediately, including closing the road, fencing off the meadow, and revoking the association's ability to use the dock or the land behind the clubhouse. Then he delivered the line that sent a visible wave of alarm through the room. If Mr. Foster chooses to enforce his rights fully, the association will lose access to the clubhouse grounds entirely, he said, letting the weight of that statement settle over the crowd. Natalie's composure finally cracked her carefully, maintained authority dissolving in front of the very residents she had spent years commanding. Benjamin raised a hand gently, asking for a moment to speak, and the room fell into an uneasy silence as everyone waited to hear what the man they had almost had arrested intended to do with the power that had just fallen so completely into his hands. In the days that followed the clubhouse meeting, Benjamin quietly requested access to every financial and maintenance record the association had generated over the past 13 years, a request the newly nervous board approved without hesitation. What those records revealed painted a picture far more damaging than anyone had anticipated. Association funds had been used repeatedly to install directional signage along the access road, to pave and repave sections of it, to build and maintain the boat dock, and to host community events on the meadow and the land behind the clubhouse, all without a single lease easement or permit connecting any of that spending to legitimate legal authority. Thomas Reyes, the quieter board member who had said little during the earlier confrontations, was the one who eventually admitted the depth of the problem out loud. He told Benjamin somewhat reluctantly that the association had spent an estimated $190,000 over the years maintaining and improving land it never actually owned, money collected from resident dues under the assumption that the association held clear title to every common area in the neighborhood. Diane Whitfield, reviewing the same records, independently discovered something even more troubling. Signage near the dock explicitly stated that the area was association property, a claim that had apparently gone unchallenged for over a decade, simply because no one, including Walter Higgins's own family during his lifetime, had ever bothered to dispute it. As the scope of the situation became clear, the board members began turning on one another in a way that surprised even the residents watching from the sidelines. Robert Hale accused Natalie of never properly verifying the association's boundaries when she took over as president, insisting he had raised concerns years earlier that were dismissed without investigation. Natalie fired back that the assumption predated her leadership entirely, and that she had simply continued practices established long before she ever held any position of authority. The tension between them grew sharp enough that Diane Whitfield eventually excused herself from the conversation, entirely unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of blame neither of them seemed willing to accept personally. Despite the mounting evidence, Natalie continued insisting there had to be some path forward that did not involve fully acknowledging the association's error, suggesting repeatedly that perhaps a compromise could be reached without formally recognizing 13 years of unauthorized use. Benjamin listened to her arguments patiently as he had throughout the entire ordeal, but eventually decided the moment for polite ambiguity had passed. He asked her a question calmly, without any visible satisfaction, though the weight of it landed heavily across the room. "Would you like to see the rental value for the past 13 years, he asked, and the silence that followed made clear that nobody, including Natalie, actually wanted an answer to that question. The financial records once fully compiled made it undeniable that the association had been operating on borrowed time for over a decade, using land it never controlled and spending resident dues on infrastructure. It had no legal claim. 2. Word of the discovery spread through Cedar Hollow Estates faster than any rumor before it, and residents who had once trusted the association without question began demanding a full accounting of exactly how something this significant could have gone unnoticed for so long. That demand led directly to an emergency meeting called for the following Saturday, one that would prove to be the most contentious gathering the community had ever seen, and one that would ultimately determine whether Natalie Brooks had any future at all. Within the organization, she had led for 6 years. The community center was packed well beyond its usual capacity that Saturday morning, with residents standing along the walls after every chair had been claimed, all of them eager to hear how the board intended to explain 13 years of unauthorized land use. Natalie stood at the podium, looking considerably less composed than she had during any previous confrontation. Her prepared remarks doing little to calm a crowd that had spent the past week discovering just how much of their community infrastructure sat on someone else's property. Before she could finish her opening statement, a resident near the front interrupted, demanding to know why the board had never bothered verifying something as basic as property ownership before spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in place dues. Benjamin had been invited to speak, and when he stepped up to the podium, the room grew noticeably quieter, as though everyone present understood that whatever he said next would carry more weight than anything Natalie could offer. He did not raise his voice, did not gloat, and did not frame himself as any kind of victim. He simply laid out the documents on the table beside him. The same deed survey and closing statement Gregory Lawson had presented earlier, along with photographs comparing the recorded boundary lines to the actual footprint of the road, the dock, and the meadow the association had been using without permission. He explained plainly that his goal had never been to punish anyone, only to clarify a situation that had clearly gone uncorrected for far too long, and that he wanted the residents themselves to understand the full picture before any decisions were made about how to move forward. His calm, factual approach seemed to diffuse some of the anger in the room, redirecting it away from him and squarely toward the leadership that had allowed the situation to persist. Natalie, sensing the room turning against her, attempted to regain control of the narrative, insisting that she had inherited this arrangement and could not be held responsible for decisions made before her presidency began. That claim did not survive long. A former board member named Charlotte Wynn, who had served alongside Natalie during her first 2 years as president, stood up from the back of the room and asked to speak. She told the crowd that she distinctly remembered raising concerns about the boundary lines nearly 5 years earlier after noticing inconsistencies in an old survey filed with the county, and that Natalie had dismissed those concerns at the time, telling her the paperwork was outdated and not worth pursuing. The room erupted into murmurs, and Natalie's face flushed as she struggled to respond to an accusation she clearly had not expected to surface in front of so many people. Several board members, watching the tide of public opinion shift decisively, began quietly distancing themselves from Natalie's leadership. Robert Hale announced on the spot that he intended to resign from the board entirely, stating that he no longer felt confident in the association's ability to operate honestly under its current structure. 2 other members followed his lead within minutes, offering brief, uncomfortable resignations before slipping toward the exits, leaving Natalie standing nearly alone at the podium she had once commanded with such confidence. By the time the meeting adjourned, it had become clear to everyone present that the coming weeks would bring far more change than anyone had anticipated when Benjamin Foster first moved into that quiet cabin by the lake, and that Natalie Brooks's grip on the community she had ruled for 6 years was slipping away faster than she could find the words to stop it. In the aftermath of that chaotic meeting, Benjamin found himself in an unusual position, holding more leverage over the community than anyone in Cedar Hollow Estates had ever possessed, and residents waited anxiously to see how he intended to use it. Rather than pursuing punishment, Benjamin requested a private meeting with the remaining board members and a handful of resident representatives where he laid out a proposal that surprised almost everyone who heard it. He told them plainly that he had no interest in destroying the community or profiting off their years of mistake, but that any path forward would require honesty, fair compensation, and real structural change. He outlined his terms, carefully explaining that the association could continue using the road, the dock, and the land behind the clubhouse, but only under a properly recorded lease agreement with clearly defined terms. He proposed a modest symbolic monthly fee rather than anything resembling market rate compensation for 13 years of unauthorized use, a gesture that visibly relieved several residents who had feared a lawsuit substantial enough to bankrupt the association entirely. In exchange, he requested that the association formally repeal several of its more aggressive bylaws, particularly those granting the board broad authority to fine residents for minor cosmetic violations without any independent review process. Finally, he asked for a public acknowledgement of the error, not as an act of humiliation, but as a matter of basic transparency owed to residents who had been paying dues under false assumptions for over a decade. He made clear that if the board rejected these terms, he retained every legal right to close the road, remove the dock and fence off the meadow immediately, a consequence that would leave many homes without convenient access and strip the community of amenities it had relied upon for years. The choice, he told them, was entirely theirs, and he would abide by whatever decision they reached without further pressure from him. Residents who had gathered to hear the proposal reacted with a mixture of relief and quiet astonishment, having expected someone in Benjamin's position to demand far more, given everything the association had put him through in his prior first week as a homeowner. Carol Jennings, the neighbor who had first warned him about Natalie's reputation, told him afterward that his restraint said more about his character than anything else he could have done with the leverage he now held. Slowly, one by one, residents began approaching Benjamin not with suspicion but with something closer to gratitude, recognizing that a man they had almost seen arrested was now offering the community a far gentler outcome than it likely deserved. Natalie, however, remained largely silent throughout the proposal, watching as the very residents who once deferred to her began openly siding with the man she had tried to have removed from his own home. Her authority, already fractured by the resignations and public accusations from the previous meeting, seemed to dissolve entirely in that room, replaced by a growing consensus that new leadership was needed if the association intended to rebuild any trust at all. What followed in the weeks ahead would determine not only the future of Cedar Hollow Estates, but the personal fate of the woman who had once believed her authority extended over land she never legally controlled. A special vote was scheduled for the following month, giving residents the opportunity to formally decide whether Natalie Brooks would remain president of the Homeowners Association after everything that had come to light. The turnout was unlike anything the community had seen in years, with residents who had never before bothered attending a single meeting showing up specifically to cast their ballots. Natalie campaigned briefly to retain her position, insisting in a final address that her leadership had brought stability to the neighborhood for 6 years, and that a single misunderstanding over boundary lines should not erase everything else she had accomplished during her tenure. Her argument found little support in a room full of people who had spent the past month discovering just how many small tyrannies had gone unquestioned under her leadership, from disputed fines over paint colors to selective enforcement of parking rules that always seemed to favor her closest allies. When the votes were finally counted, the result was decisive rather than close, with an overwhelming majority favoring her removal from office. A new board was elected the same evening, led by Diane Whitfield, who had earned quiet respect throughout the ordeal for her willingness to acknowledge mistakes rather than defend them reflexively. Natalie attempted one final time to shift blame elsewhere, telling a small cluster of remaining supporters that the entire situation had been engineered by Benjamin from the moment he arrived, suggesting he had somehow orchestrated the classed confrontation specifically to seize control of community assets. Nobody found the claim convincing. Least of all, the residents who had personally witnessed her call the police on a man who had done nothing more than calmly refuse to sign paperwork he had no legal obligation to sign. Within days of the vote, formal negotiations between Benjamin and the new board concluded successfully, resulting in a properly recorded lease agreement covering the road, the dock, and the meadow, along with a full repeal of the bylaws he had specifically requested be removed. The new agreement was posted publicly for every resident to review, a level of transparency the association had never practiced under Natalie's leadership, where financial decisions and boundary questions had often been handled quietly, among a small inner circle. Diane Whitfield, addressing the community shortly after taking office, promised that every future decision regarding shared land fees or enforcement would be documented and made available for any resident to inspect at will. The relief throughout the neighborhood was palpable, a sense that something broken had finally been repaired, not through confrontation or lawsuits, but through patience and documented truth. Weeks later, during a casual conversation near the newly repaired dock, a longtime resident named Harold Beckett remarked to a small group gathered nearby that none of this transparency, none of this accountability would have ever come to light if Natalie had simply left Benjamin alone on that very first afternoon. If she hadn't called the police that day, none of this would have ever happened, he said, and the small group around him nodded in quiet agreement, recognizing the strange irony that the very confrontation meant to remove Benjamin from the neighborhood was the exact event that ultimately saved it. By the time a full year had passed since Benjamin Foster first moved into his quiet cabin by the lake Cedar Hollow, estates looked and functioned like an entirely different community than the one he had encountered on that tense first afternoon. The access road, once cracked and poorly maintained, despite years of association spending, had been fully repaved under Benjamin's direction, funded partly through the modest lease payments the new board gladly honored each month. The old dock, previously little more than warped wood and rusted hardware, had been rebuilt with sturdy new pilings, becoming once again a gathering place for families during the warmer months, without any lingering dispute over who had the right to use it. Benjamin continued leasing the meadow, the road, and the dock to the association at a rate far below market value, a decision he never publicly explained beyond saying that fairness mattered more to him than profit. He worked closely with Diane Whitfield and the newly elected board to establish a formal set of governance rules, ensuring that no future president could unilaterally declare authority over land, impose sweeping fines, or bypass resident oversight the way Natalie once had. Every financial record, every boundary document, and every fee schedule became part of a publicly accessible archive, a level of openness that transformed the association from something residents feared into something they genuinely trusted. The new homeowners association bore little resemblance to the one Benjamin had first encountered. Fines for minor cosmetic violations were eliminated, entirely replaced by a simple system of friendly notices and voluntary compliance that residents actually respected, because it no longer felt like punishment. Every major decision, from budget allocations to maintenance priorities, went through a genuine vote rather than a rubber stamp from a small circle of loyalists. And attendance at meetings grew steadily, as residents realized their voices actually shaped outcomes now. Through all of this, Benjamin himself never joined the association, a fact that occasionally puzzled newer residents who assumed, given how closely he worked with the board, that he must simply be an unofficial member by now. Whenever someone asked him directly why he still refused to sign the very membership forms Natalie had once tried to force upon him, he would offer the same quiet, unhurried smile he had shown from the very first day. "Why aren't you a member?" people would ask. Genuinely curious rather than accusatory, and Benjamin would simply shrug and give them the same calm answer every time. Because owners don't need permission to own what is already theirs, he would tell them, and most people who heard it understood immediately that the statement meant far more than it appeared to on the surface. Natalie Brooks left Cedar Hollow Estates entirely within a few months of losing the presidency, selling her home quietly, and relocating to a different part of the state without any public farewell to the neighborhood she had once ruled with such rigid authority. Few residents mourned her departure, and fewer still spoke of her afterward, except as a cautionary example of what happens when unchecked power goes unquestioned for too long. The association she left behind became something of a model within the region, occasionally referenced by other communities looking to reform their own governance structures after hearing how thoroughly Cedar Hollow Estates had rebuilt itself from the ground up. Benjamin Foster, for his part, never sought recognition for what he had done, never framed himself as any kind of hero, and rarely spoke about the events of that first year, unless directly asked. Residents who once eyed him with suspicion during those tense early weeks came to regard him with a quiet, lasting respect, not because he had wielded power over them, but because he had chosen again and again to use the law calmly rather than turn his advantage into revenge. In a neighborhood that had spent years mistaking authority for ownership, Benjamin had proven something far simpler and far more enduring: that legitimate ownership will always outlast the illusion of control, and that patience backed by truth is often the most powerful response of all.